Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Purpose Tune podcast. The goal of the show is to create valuable content to broaden your knowledge, inspire you to act, and get you in the right mindset so you can apply it in your own life to drive impact, generate meaning, and achieve your purpose. Now, today's episode's guest is Mark Graban. Mark is an author, speaker, consultant, and podcaster. He has more than 25 years of experience with continuous improvement practices in multiple industries, including the last 16 years in healthcare. His most recent book is Measures of Success: React Last, Lead Better, Improve More. And his newest podcast is called My Favorite Mistake. Mark, thank you so much for joining me today. How are you doing?
I'm great, Kong. Thanks for having me here. I love talking about purpose, and I think we'll have a good conversation here today. So thanks.
Yeah, me too. I'm so excited to have you here because you come from the leadership space. And of course, aside from what I do as a podcaster, I engage with leaders on all sorts of leadership things, and one of the topics that do come up is on purpose. And so if you could share with us what has been your experience working with business leaders as it relates to purpose.
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I think one of the challenges with a topic like leadership is different people will define leadership differently, what the characteristics, the behavioral traits of a leader are. In a lot of cases, even that purpose can be defined differently by different leaders, sometimes explicitly, sometimes it's kind of hidden and it sneaks out. So like one example I can think of, like for me, I think the purpose of a leader is to support their employees and to help their employees be successful, to help their employees improve, maybe first and foremost, to help their employees be safe. I think of servant leadership. There's that modifier. We could just call it leadership or good leadership. There's servant leadership. A lot of leaders, unfortunately, will view the purpose in a very self-focused or I guess self-centered sort of way. I won't say which company this was, but before I got into healthcare, I worked at a large company. And I think the moment when I realized, okay, I don't think this is a good fit for me, we define leadership differently, was a day when the director that I was working for looked at me and said with all seriousness, his words, I'm paraphrasing, he said, "My job is to make my boss look good." And so that what I heard was, well, then therefore, he was defining my job as making him look good. And I'm like, no, I reject that. I'm not trying to make him look bad, but I define, performance in relation to customers and broader business goals and taking care of the employees. If it's just about making him look good, like there are all kinds of dysfunctional ways that could have been possible. And, I guess that's just a level of politics and a definition of his purpose that wasn't aligned with mine. So I got out.
Wow, that's incredible to hear that. Thank you for sharing that story. The fact that you're able to realize quite quickly how their values don't align with yours and getting out was the best thing for you. A lot of people would choose to stay because out of fear of not having security.
Right.
But I think for someone such as yourself who is purpose driven, knows exactly what he wants in life and chooses not to stay and be in a situation that will hinder your progress of personal growth. And so that's great to hear. How did you get into this space, this leadership space in healthcare?
So I think there's a couple stages to that. My undergraduate degree is industrial engineering, which is quite technical, I guess, all things considered. Other engineers, let's say electrical engineers, might say it's not as technical, but it's a fairly, it's a technical math-based field. But the one thing I enjoyed when I finally figured out that industrial engineering was a good fit for me is that we were looking at business issues, and a lot of those issues then involve people. And, I think I had good role models, and opportunities to try to practice leadership and stumble my way through it. 8 years of marching band in high school and college, and being a leader in that setting. Playing on sports teams in high school, in particular the tennis team, and being a team captain, and at times looking back, not always being a great leader, and or having moments that I would look back on and be embarrassed by. So, I think being driven to try to become a better leader was helped by having leaders who were good role models. I think of, college marching band director, for example. I can think of leaders in early jobs. I mean, I worked for some leaders in my first job out of college at General Motors. Some leaders that would be sort of, textbook, in my mind, bad leaders. But then I've worked for some who were great. And I saw the contrast. And I saw the role of, let's say, in a manufacturing company that a plant manager has. The top person at a local site of about 1,000 people, the senior leader defines the culture. They're kind of, demonstrating in a positive way or a negative way what's permissible and how others should be behaving. And that lesson I learned at General Motors, that was, I think, duplicated in different parts of the company in the mid-90s as they were learning from Toyota and bringing in a different leadership style that I've been deeply influenced by, was just to see you can have a facility. I think this would be true of a software company. It would be true of a hospital. The same people, the same space, doing the same work with a different style of leadership can perform really, can perform much better than they were performing under a style of leadership that, I would define as being like really controlling, being a boss instead of a leader, if you will. So I've seen firsthand, that the role of leaders is critically important. And I think that's just driven me to try to become a better leader, to study leadership, to try to help coach and help others.
That's amazing to hear that. I'm interested in your take and in how you look at leadership, both from a personal and a professional standpoint. So, of course, for folks that have clients or executives of their division, they tend to work long hours and oftentimes don't have personal time. But when they do spend their personal time with people they care about, does that leadership gets translate over to the personal life? Like, how do they live it inside out, or what's your take on that? Like, do they show up differently with different people at the office versus at home? What's your take?
Well, I mean, I think one way I would define, I think the best leaders are able to be their authentic selves. I saw when I was at General Motors, some of the leadership behaviors were almost an intentional act. And I remember talking to one of those leaders who I didn't think was a good role model, and sort of asking him, why do you yell and scream and curse at people? Why do you belittle people? Why do you try to shame people into better performance? Because I was on my way out the door to grad school, and I felt brave. I figured the consequences of even bringing up that, hey, why do you act this way? Question, the consequences were, where it wasn't too risky at that point. And he said basically, well, he was expected to act this way because his boss acts that way, and he traced it all the way up to the General Motors board of directors. And I think he was saying basically, well, this is the company culture. And it was a culture some people were trying to change. But I remember, so back what triggered some memories here when you talk about, well, how is somebody like that outside of work? I'd hate to think he was yelling and screaming at his family or his grandchildren or shaming them into trying to get better grades. I mean, was this his personality, or was it just something that he put on, like a suit, a shield, a mask, if you will? And so I remember like one Friday or Saturday night, I was out with a small group of friends at a restaurant, and I thought, oh no, his name was Bob. I'm like, there's Bob. Oh gosh, I get enough Bob during the week. But the thing I noticed is that he was there with a large group, if I remember right, and I have a very clear picture of this for some reason in my head. He was there with a dozen people, maybe. I'm guessing, children and in-laws and maybe even grandchildren, like a multi-generational evening out. And he was smiling more than I had ever seen him smile in the workplace. His family seemed to love him. They seemed to enjoy being around him. I'll give him credit. Like, he actually sent some drinks over to the table. And like, all right, well, and it kind of reinforced, like, work Bob was very different than normal daily life Bob. And I'm sure, I'm guessing he must have felt some tension, or maybe he just got used to that mask or behaving the way the company expected him to behave. Where nowadays, I think of people I know who are really good leaders. I think they demonstrate similar personality traits at work as they would at home. Like if at work they're, a patient, servant leader who's helping people solve problems and perform better. I know people like that who bring what we would consider workplace behaviors back home, like to teach their children how to be better problem solvers, because that's such a really good life skill, not just a work skill of, like, for example, like learning to not jump to conclusions about the cause of a problem, or not jumping to solutions before considering other things that you might want to test and try. I think, at least for me, like I want to be myself at work. Like that seems like the least exhausting, most productive way to be.
Right. And if you think about it from an energy standpoint, if most of your energy is used masking oneself, then what about the productivity of our work? How are we going to get the energy to perform at our jobs? And I think your situation, and thank you for sharing that story about the guy. I don't think any leadership style like that would work in today's marketplace. I think they would directly get reported to HR. I think that, and that's a good thing. And it shows that, today's company culture is changing to try to meet the demands and needs of their employees, which is that employees want a culture where they can feel free to make mistakes and not be judged by it. So essentially creating a psychological safety environment where they can do that. Working with a leader that has high emotional intelligence can read a person and really sense how they're feeling and thinking, and finding ways to help them improve on their job or help them advance in their career, the company or outside of the company. And a leader, to me, like you said, you touched on the authenticity component. Some of the most inspiring leaders I've seen and had the privilege to work alongside are those that, of course, not just showcase all the elements that I just mentioned of high emotional intelligence and creating psychological safety, but also having the ability to empower and inspire people to do their best work in an environment where they belong. And there's a lot of work to creating a culture that works for all employees. Obviously, you have to talk about, you have to launch surveys and get the feel of your employees, what they're wanting for a culture, and how can the company culture be better, but also meeting the future needs of of their employees as well. And so all of that is great information to creating an effective company. What's your take on purpose? How do you define it?
That's it's almost, well, I mean, it's almost easier to say what I think my purpose is, and then maybe we can step back and deconstruct what is purpose. Well, I guess it's motivation, it's driving forces, it's the fire in the belly. Like for me, I think it's two things. People shouldn't hate coming to work. Like, I mean, I saw, the first job out of college, and I've seen in other settings, and sadly, sometimes in healthcare, where people get burned out, beaten down, worn down by the culture and the workplace that surrounds them. And back to what you were saying earlier, they don't have the freedom or the flexibility to leave. Like when I left a couple of these jobs, I was young and single, and I mean, I was just didn't have anything keeping me a job. There are people who are stuck in a situation that they can't change. That's why I think leaders and organizations have an obligation to try to create a culture that's engaging, that's supportive and participatory, because we all do better. So back to purpose, I think two simple statements. People shouldn't hate coming to work. And then the second statement would be people shouldn't get hurt at work. And we could connect that to physical safety first and foremost. And then we could also connect it to psychological safety. Because I've seen studies that point to the impact of, if you will, a toxic work environment, being subjected to bad leaders, how that causes relationship problems for people, that causes physical health problems. So the element of safety might not be, did that nurse throw her back out and get injured on the job, or did somebody in a manufacturing facility lose a finger? I mean, there are injuries that are harder to see and more subtle that can really have a bad effect on people's lives. So I'm kind of idealistic about it, but I know we can create environments that are better for people.
Speaking of creating environments that are better for people, and as it relates to healthcare, I have my set of clients, and some of the common challenges I've heard from them are the boss wants me to meet the numbers. It's all about processing as many clients or patients as possible. So not really focusing on the outcome of the patient outcome, but more so about how quickly can you see patients, which has caused this tension between physicians and executive leadership team. And what's your take on that? How can healthcare providers create an environment where both the employees or the physicians can be taken care of, while at the same time taking care of patients, increasing patient outcomes?
Yeah. So, one thing that I've learned and seen in different settings is results, whether that's the number of patients we see every hour, or end results, such as what percentage of our patients have their diabetes under control, for example. Think of a health outcome measure. Those results are driven by systems and processes and structure. And senior leaders are most responsible for that high level structure. There's this kind of dual nature of improvement styles that come from Toyota, which is a company and a management style that's influenced me greatly. Kind of two sides of a coin here. One, I think of an expression I've heard many times from my friend Daryl Wilburn, who worked for Toyota in the US for a long time. He says, it's the responsibility of leaders to create an environment in which people can be successful. So that's the one side of the coin. The responsibility of leaders. You can't just delegate improvement to your frontline staff. Now, the other side of the coin, though, is that we do involve frontline staff in continuous improvement and process improvement, right? So saying the leader is responsible for creating a system doesn't mean the leader makes all the decisions, but there are certain decisions that only the leader can make, such as staffing levels and other things that might affect the ability of doctors and other healthcare providers to see X number of patients per hour. I would say, it's an abdication of leadership to just set a target and say, you're on your own, go figure it out. Like, what do you need the leader for then?
Right.
So I think, there's this dual nature of, at times setting challenging goals, but then here's the thing, we're going to work together to improve the system. And we're not going to just blame or even worse, bully people for not hitting the numbers. I saw that the bad leadership style at General Motors, and that was starting to change. There are software companies or any environment that's very sales driven. Salespeople are given a quota that might be completely unrealistic, and they're just, pressured or bullied into, hit the number no matter what. Well, think of all the dysfunctional things that can happen in an organization when somebody's suboptimizing to hit, a local quota or target, and dysfunctional things can happen in healthcare. So, I think it comes back to that dual nature of, I think the most effective leadership styles are certainly not completely top down, but it's not completely bottom up either. The leader can't just set a goal and tell employees, do whatever you want. I don't care as long as you get the results I'm demanding. There's this middle ground where, leaders help set maybe, inspiring mission and goals, and then help and collaborate with people to figure out, well, how do we get from here to there? Not just pressuring people, or worse yet, we're going to keep firing people and hiring new people in the hopes that we'll eventually hire somebody who figures it out. Like that's to me, that's not sophisticated leadership. That's not effective leadership.
Right. So there are two things that I want to touch on in all of this. First is influence. When you think about having leadership support, and then also the employees doing the work to meet in the middle to create a transformation within a culture. I think about mid-level leaders, how they are at the center of it all, and they are by far some of the most influential people within an organization, because they get the message from senior leaders, and they also work with their direct reports to change behavior. And so that's the first point. The second is, when we talk about creating a culture where employees and senior leaders see eye to eye on things, but haven't found a plan forward, like what does that mean for the organization when there's not a concrete, clear strategy or steps that employees need to take? They get the message from their leaders, but they just don't know how to deal with it all. Maybe because they are in this mindset of, we've always done it this way. We don't want to change. Change is hard. We hate change. It's like, how do you get people to change their behavior? Any on that?
Yeah, there's a lot of interesting things you bring up there. Like, for one, this whole phrase of people hating change, or people being quote unquote resistant to change. I think it's more accurate, like, if a leader points to people and says, those people hate change, the more accurate statement might be, those people don't want to do what I'm telling them to do. Right. So there's a different cause there. Instead of blaming people for being resistant to change, a leader should look in the mirror and say, well, do I have the wrong idea? Maybe they hate this change because it's not really an improvement. Or, we have to help people work through change as a process. Change is not flipping a light switch. Like, oh, I went to a 90-minute class and you've convinced me, and now I'm going to just flip a switch and do things this new way. Leaders need to work with people and think of change as more of this ongoing process, and stop blaming people for being resistant. That's one thing that comes up a lot in the work that I do. But then I think one other thing you touched on, Kong, is the managers in the middle of the organization are often caught in a really awkward situation. Like I know a lot of like the most effective healthcare executives that I know, and I've had a chance, to interview a lot of them in some of the different podcast series I do. They'll state very clearly that, if the old phrase, we watched a documentary about like 1969 the other day, there's this old phrase, the revolution will not be televised. I think the related phrase that comes to mind is the transformation will not be delegated. The CEO has to lead the culture change. Like in my first job out of college at General Motors, the plant manager had to lead the transformation. And thankfully, we got a new plant manager who was able to come in and lead by example and model and demonstrate a new way of leadership. So I think where I've seen the most impressive improvement happening in healthcare related to some of the most important measures around safety and quality, the CEO realizes you can't just hire a VP of something or other and say, well, you're responsible for this. That just doesn't work. I mean, there may be a time and a place and a role for a vice president of patient safety, but responsibility for safety ultimately can't be delegated. If you have this VP who's being told you need to change the culture, but then it's being continually sort of counteracted by what the CEO and other C-suite executives are doing, that VP is just going to be set up for failure or frustration or sleepless nights or right. What have you. So the most effective leaders I've seen realize, again, and that doesn't mean they do it all themselves, but the responsibility is clearly with them as the senior executive in the situation.
Right. Yeah. I love that. I was watching I was on YouTube the other night and I was watching Mr. Wonderful. I don't know if you watch Shark Tank.
Kevin O'Leary, right?
Yes, Kevin O'Leary.
Yeah.
He was saying that when you have employees that think that they are irreplaceable, that's a red flag. Maybe perhaps he was, referencing, employees with high egos, or maybe because, the market changes, and so companies need to be flexible. They need to, be adaptable and resilient, which means that they're going to have to anticipate, firing, laying off people, and hiring new talent. So I was just thinking, well, if that's the advice that he's giving companies, why would employees be loyal to companies if they know that they can get fired and that they are replaceable?
Yeah.
So I am thinking, well, this, and again, to be fair, this was a clip that I saw. It was published 6 years ago. So a lot of things have changed since then. So maybe his take on it is now different. But I just want to know what your thoughts are on how, why it's important for companies to hire new talent, inject new blood to the company, and also your take on if employees feel they're replaceable, why should they choose to be loyal?
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think sort of like my advice to leaders is don't blame employees for appearing like they're resistant to change. I also wouldn't blame employees for being quote unquote disloyal. That's a cultural issue within the organization. Leaders need to create an environment that respects people, create an environment that allows people to be fully engaged in work that's fulfilling to them. I mean, I think the best situation of bringing in new talent without just having churn is to continue growing. Like, I think back to the old Jack Welch General Electric model of, fire your bottom 10% every year. Like that never sounded like a good idea to me. And there are many, well-documented dysfunctions that come out of a situation and mindset like that. And even in his retirement, before he passed away, Jack Welch, kind of renounced that approach. But a lot of companies say, well, oh, look, GE was super successful. They fire the bottom 10%. Therefore, we're going to do that too. And think of how much chaos and pain and harm that caused.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, you want to view, there's, again, maybe two sides of the coin. I mean, you don't want to have if an organization is so dependent on individual efforts or unique talent of like, I'm irreplaceable. This place would fall apart if I won the lottery and left. That's a systemic problem. Like that tells me an organization doesn't have good processes and good systems. But the other side of that coin is, having good systems and processes doesn't mean we throw people out on a whim, right? So I think one thing I admire a lot about Toyota is their deep commitment to their employees. This is not necessarily the old Japanese lifetime employment model, but Toyota has such a pronounced and demonstrated commitment to their employees. And the example I can think of is during periods when there aren't many cars being sold, financial crisis, earthquake that hits Japan and knocks a part plant offline. During the pandemic, chip shortages are happening now. A company like General Motors, or now even Tesla, which is a newer company, which I would argue seems to be managed in the old way, more like GM than Toyota. And that's not a compliment. I'm sure you figured it out. Companies will think nothing about putting workers on temporary layoff. Where a company like Toyota will pay people to come in, and if they're not building cars and trucks, Toyota will pay them to do quality improvement work. They will pay the employees to get training, which increases the employee's value to the company, and it helps the company perform better. Toyota would even pay teams of people to go out and build Habitat for Humanity houses, which is providing benefit to the community, but that's building teamwork and leadership skills to participate in activities like that. And, I think that model where, you show a commitment to your employees, you stick with them during hard times. There's one hospital CEO at UMass Memorial Health in Worcester, Massachusetts. During the pandemic, and I had a chance to interview him about this in one of my other podcast series, they were very public and very serious about no furloughs, no layoffs, where it was almost kind of taken as a default in the industry, and leaders will say things like, well, we had no choice but to lay people off. And I said, well, no. It was a choice. Like, own the choice. Don't hide behind things like, well, we were forced to, and we had no choice. Like, that tells your employees you're disposable. And then, now that things are picking up again, go figure that some of these hospitals are having trouble hiring people. Now, there's all kinds of factors of burnout from the pandemic, and but some organizations, I think, with different styles of leadership, weathered this pandemic storm better than others.
Right. Yeah, and I've even seen some companies where they've decreased the executive pay and delegate that some of that pay to their employees, so that they can continue keeping their employees, because they know that the pandemic it's only a very brief moment in history, and that they need their employees with experiences within the company, knowledge, and skills to continue doing that work. It takes just as much effort, if not more, to identify talent, train them, and get them up to speed with processes, systems, and products, and all that stuff. And so I think we're seeing a shift in terms of companies getting it, that they need to create a culture of people first, that they need to put their employees as a top priority, and that they need to create a culture where people can really belong and be who they are and show up authentically and do their best work. being their best version. What inspires you to do this work?
I mean, I think going back to the motivations and purpose around, people shouldn't hate coming to work. People shouldn't get hurt at work. There's still a lot of work to be done on those fronts. And it can seem daunting at times, but I guess the one thing that keeps me going is when you see pockets of progress. And you see, people start to get out of the cycle of burnout and start turning things around. There's a great leader in the healthcare realm, Quint Studer, who had been a hospital CEO and is a well-known consultant and author in the healthcare space. And Quint Studer, like a lot of people do, use this analogy of a flywheel. And I think there's the negative flywheel of people are dejected, they're not being treated well, they're understaffed, they're overworked, organization's not performing well. What do? They get rid of more people. Like this just starts spiraling, if not circling the drain. But what I've seen, when you start engaging people in improvement, you start working together with them as leaders instead of blaming the employees, you can start getting that flywheel spinning in a positive direction. And like any sort of flywheel, it takes time to get it up and going and build that momentum. And then once it's going, the idea is that momentum almost keeps it going. It's not a perpetual motion machine because you need a continual injection of energy. And there's one expression I learned along the way. That says the role of leaders is to add energy to the system. Now, like thermodynamics wise, I mean, at some point energy can't be created or destroyed, but maybe locally you can add energy to help get positive momentum going. And so like, I know organizations can be turned around. And again, a lot of it comes from new leaders at the top because they are less wedded to the way it's always been. They have more freedom to start modeling a different way for the organization. Like that change at the top isn't a cure-all, but like I think sometimes it's hard for a leader or really difficult for a leader to be transformational if they've already been at the place for 5 or 10 or 20 years. Like they are the existing system. How do you transform? How do you transform the existing system? It's almost easier to come in as an outsider for a lot of reasons.
Yeah. I completely agree with you that leaders at companies set the tone for their employees, and they are the essentially the change makers. They of course they have a lot of power and influence to change your company culture. Do you have people that you follow, people who inspire you to continue doing the work that you're doing when moments are challenging? Or books even that you read that you can offer?
Yeah. So, like I said, I find a lot of inspiration from Toyota people and some of the books about Toyota and their culture and their improvement model and their management system. Quint Studer in the healthcare space is one of those people. Amy Edmondson from Harvard Business School, who writes a lot about psychological safety. Like I find her very insightful and inspiring, especially when people can share stories of, places that are changing and demonstrating that there are different, better leadership models. There's a few other people like, Seth Godin, who writes just a lot of really short, wise, pithy blog posts that often touch on some of the continuous improvement leadership styles or servant leadership styles or customer focused business practices that I find really exciting. David Marquette. There are two different books. I have no military background personally or in direct family, but there are two books that were written about Navy ships. One might have been a sub, but one book is called It's Your Ship. and another book is called Turn the Ship Around. And it talks about like this culture change and the difference in leadership styles from the old boss driven, boss knows all, top down, command and control environment to one that's more participatory. Like those examples and the things that those authors keep putting out is really inspiring. Stanley McChrystal, who was Army, as a general, his book Team of Teams talks about this kind of culture shift. So like, well, if it can happen in the military, which you think would be so rooted in tradition and the way it's always been, that leaders have shown there's a different way. And I think that's inspiring for hospitals and different types of companies that might be stuck in their own, this is the way it's always been approach to leadership.
Right. So what's your take on Renee Brown's work on power vulnerability? She talks a lot about courage and how showing vulnerability and authenticity is actually a huge component of courage. And her TED talk, which went viral many years ago, really, to me, brings out this notion that if leaders, if they're leading teams and divisions and companies, they must also have baggages that they bring with them. And those baggages, personal baggages, oftentimes impact how they engage and treat people. So what's your take on all of that?
Well, I don't know her work real deeply, but her name has come up in a couple episodes of My Favorite Mistake, where that podcast, I think for a guest to come on and talk about, sometimes a big mistake that they learned from and affected their career in some positive way, does require some vulnerability. And I think that's a show of strength. Like some people would view, vulnerability as a weakness. And I'm like, no, I think it takes a lot of strength to have the courage to tell a story that maybe doesn't make you look that good. So like one of my first guests was a different shark from Shark Tank, Kevin Harrington.
Okay.
And and I think whether it's a role model from the business world or a role model in our organization, I think that authenticity or vulnerability to speak honestly about challenges and mistakes and quote unquote bad decisions. It's the best decision we made at the time, but whoops, we've learned from it. I think when leaders are unwilling to have that sort of vulnerability, I think back to, again, like in that one company, my job is to make my boss look good. Like that can lead to hiding of problems.
Right.
That's, maybe saves your butt in the short term, but that's not good for the company.
Right.
Longer term. So I think that honesty, that authenticity, that vulnerability is a really crucial part of ongoing improvement and success. So I've been meaning, I need to dig deeper into her work. I know some people who are certified Renee Brown facilitators, and I should probably follow their lead and get a little bit deeper into her work.
Yeah, she's really put a dent into how we live, lead, and love, for sure. And speaking about authenticity, you bring all of that to work, and so her work is powerful in terms of influencing people to become more effective in the workplace, but also in their personal lives. And of course, there's Simon Sinek, who talks about purpose too. And I appreciate that you bring up the books about the military service and what leadership is like in the military. And there's an episode that I listened to where Simon talked about how corporations they when they have to improve their reputation or their brand, they often award leaders by cutting staff
Mhm.
to achieve a certain outcome. In the military, if you sacrifice your life for your the person next to you in a
Mhm.
battle, you're awarded a medal. And so the whole concept of leadership is just completely different from, what's in the military and versus what's in corporate America. And
Yeah.
so that was just such a powerful take, analysis that you made.
Yeah, well, thanks. So I'm a big fan of Simon Sinek's work. So yeah, Start With Why is a great book. One of his earlier books, Leaders Eat Last, is a story about the military and going to the mess hall and like literally, leaders letting their troops eat first. And then that go back to the leader's responsibility to make sure there's enough food for everybody. The surest way to make that happen is that the leaders eat last, right?
Right.
But I'm not going to go anywhere close to naming names here, but I know somebody who works for a hospital system that had an all leaders offsite meeting. So like the C-suite all the way down to frontline managers, hundreds of them at some conference center. And they were told literally to hold back and wait, that the executives had to go get their food first because they had to get it and go to some breakout session. And like, it was really discouraging. Like somebody was, I think, being thoughtless. Right? They were thinking about efficiency of like, well, those executives have some place to be. So everybody else wait, but think of the message like that very visibly conveyed. And it probably wasn't the intentional message, but it seemed powerful because there was this buzz of like, really? Like,
Right.
I mean, it was literally a leaders eat first kind of situation. But then you think of the last thing I'll say on that is they may have the title of leader, but are they actually leaders?
Exactly. Right. It's not so much what the title the person holds, but how they treat their people that makes them memorable and inspirational to their people. I could talk forever on leadership, but we are about that time. Mark, if there are listeners that want to follow you and get in touch with you through this podcast, where can they find you?
So my website is markgraban.com. I'm easy to find on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active there. And markgraban.com website has links to my different podcasts, including My Favorite Mistake. My first podcast is hitting its 15th anniversary this summer. So My Favorite Mistake is almost to its first birthday, but I started a podcast focused on this Toyota style of management, or what we sometimes call lean management. That podcast is almost 15 years. And thank you for mentioning also earlier my books, including Measures of Success. People can learn more about those different projects and different, I wear many hats, and all of those things are kind of laid out, I guess, at markgraban.com.
That's wonderful. Thanks for sharing. Folks, if you enjoyed this podcast episode and would love to get in touch with Mark, please do so. You know where to find him. And thank you for listening. Mark, any last advice you want to offer to my listeners as relates to purpose?
Well, I think it's good to step back and reflect on purpose, because I feel like I'm fortunate where my sense of purpose formed pretty early, and is I think pretty strong and easy to rally around for myself. Somebody listening might be struggling if they're still trying to find their purpose. I bring this up not knowing exactly how to go about it, but maybe some process of reflecting or talking with loved ones or trusted colleagues to sort of try to figure out. I'm sure that purpose is there, but maybe someone's struggling how to articulate that. So I guess I would encourage people, give that a chance, practice writing it out or speaking it out, and maybe that leads to a little bit more clarity on purpose, and hopefully that's helpful.
Wonderful. Mark, thank you so much again for your time. Folks, again, please do like this episode, share it with your friends and family, and make sure to hit subscribe to this YouTube channel. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Com.